Welcome you today to this lecture put on by the African-American Studies Department as part of its activities for Black Studies month, February, as you know. The lecture today is entitled Black Studies and White Studies Beyond Howard University. And this lecture is to be given to you by none other than Dr. Russel Adams. Dr. Adams is a favorite of ours here at Fungus Library. Every year, for so many years, he has given us, imparted to us, knowledge that you can't find anywhere. He is a very special individual in that he carries a lot of our history with him. And he has written a lot of it. And if you wanted to find out more about that, always come upstairs to the reference desk and ask, and we can help you. He has written a particular book which I would like to tell you about. It's called Great Negroes, Past and Present. And so that's one thing that I think you should get your hand on and find out more about your history, and also a lot of other articles. He's also very much a historian of the American Civil War, and he knows a lot about the antebellum South. Some of you may have had his courses and would know what an encyclopedic mind he is. He is a historical icon, and here at the university he is one of our treasures. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Russel Adams.
That was mercifully brief. I know that I get the less I want to hear about my time. I've technically retired, but I'm here 2 days a week, even though my paperwork says that I'm no longer a full-time member of the Howard family. It's what you call Professor Emeritus. I want to get right to our subject, which is, I think, right on target for the month. This is Black History Month, as you know. And the occasion is one of the legacies of Carter Godwin Woodson, whom you all ought to know in some detail. There's a very good book on him by Jacqueline Goggins, G-O-G-G-I-N-S, and it's called Carter Woodson with a subtitle. And it's a very good book, and it outlines his life, his setting up of the Association for the Study of, in those days, Negro Life and History. Thus, that's the title of my book, which dates it. The book came out originally in 1963, when Negro was still the word. And now, of course, it's Afro-American. And so the association that Woodson started is known as the Association for the Study of African-American Life and History. And so times do change. There's an article that I did on why the name changes from tribal names at the time of George Washington, Mindi, Fulani, Mandingo, and so on, to black, and then from black to color, then from color at the time of Booker T. Washington to Afro-American. As a matter of fact, one of the oldest black newspapers still published started in 1892. It's called the Afro-American of Baltimore, Maryland. And you can see it on the stands as you go through the town. There was a big fight over whether or not the word Negro should be capitalized. That was a 30-year fight. And it took from James Weldon Johnson's Lift Every Voice That Sing, which came out in 1900, down to about 1940, for a lot of the southern newspapers to capitalize the word Negro. And so I traced that on that. In 1989, in Chicago, the word Afro-American, which came out during the civil rights movement to replace Negro and colors. Somebody said, Afro-American sounds like a medicine. Afro, like bromoseltzer, bromide and so on. Said, no, we are Americans and we are also Africans. And somebody said, that's right, we are both. As Du Bois pointed out in his 1903 essay, in talking about the two-ness that being African descended living in America, which I called Indian territory, Native American territory, and we are here. So that's an article that might be of some interest to you when you ask why the names change. I think the name, my argument in my piece, that the name change comes about when we say to the opposition, and by the way, we don't think that way anymore. So it's usually a resistance, a reaction that generates a name change. And I say this by way of saying that black studies and white studies are parts of an intellectual struggle that's been going on since George Washington's time, actually, where one of the earliest, what you would call black studies reactions was in 1793. At that time, the Philadelphia community of whites and blacks had gone through what was called a malaria fever epidemic, and lots of folks died. And there was a belief that blacks were not as susceptible to malaria fever as Caucasians. So they would pay blacks 2 or 3 times the going rate to serve as nurses, to serve as wagon drivers, and to serve as undertakers. And so when the thing was over, the epidemic, whites were saying, those greedy Africans took advantage of our dying white Christians. And Russel Adams, who was the Martin Luther King of that period and the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, wrote a long piece defending the race, defending the income that came from the service, and demolishing the myth that somehow blacks don't get malaria fever like other people. And that was one of the earliest attempts to deal with what folks think of each other, which is what black studies has been about. And I don't have the time to go into the details of the modern black studies movement, except to say a couple of quick things that would cover the Booker era and the Carter era. The first black think tank was put together in this town, partly at Howard, and part of it being out of Atlanta University, in 1897. And at that time, there was a learned black Episcopal bishop called Alexander Crummell, C-R-U-M-M-E-L-L, who was asked to head this group. And its mission was to do 2 or 3 quick things. Tell the truth as much as the research could uncover. Give young black scholars a chance to do their stuff, to develop, and to encourage other persons of color to take a greater interest in their own education. And it started publishing research papers, and some are very good, and you can find some across the hall in Moreland Swingon. In 1898, Du Bois was one of the first and youngest members of this group, and called himself the American Negro Academy. And it was modeled on the French Academy of 1635, where there were 40 Frenchmen, mostly self-selected, who said, we got to save the French language from dissolving into some German and some bad Italian and so on. And so the American Negro Academy says, we need to save the intellectual heritage of the race in order to pursue the truth about the race. And so from 1898 to 1928, we published 2 or 3 papers a year, solidly researched, good stuff. Some on politics, some on family, some on economics, and so on. One of Du Bois's most famous papers was called The Conservation of the Races, where he argued that races had to politically remain cohesive especially if they were fighting larger constellations of races. Then, in 1915, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, as I indicated, was organized in this kind of a context. In February 1915, Birth of a Nation came out as a movie. And it became the great hit of the era. When it was shown to Woodrow Wilson as president at the White House, he said, "This is the truth written in lightning." And then it became the first movie where folks, Caucasian, would put on their tuxedos and evening gowns to go see the film, which was a Valentine greetings to the Ku Klux Klan. The premise of Birth of a Nation was that the viciousness of the Klan against black people was justified because they were saving Western civilization on the Southern divisions. And the lynchings and all of the horror stories that came out were just reactions to what they call a barbaric, beastly, sex-crazed race. It goes on and on and on. And Woodrow Wilson said, it's the greatest thing he'd ever seen. Now, he had been president of Princeton, had been a professor at Princeton prior to that, and was now president of the country, celebrating this. That's in February. The first joint work of the NAACP and Jews took place in opposing the film. And Du Bois was a part of that. He was just 10 years out of Harvard in 1915. In September 1915, Booker dies. I'm one of these guys can do this kind of detail story, but he dies. Marcus Garvey had come to Tuskegee at Booker's invitation to try to do in the island what Booker was doing, he thought, here in the States. So when he gets to Tuskegee, Garvey finds the whole campus in mourning because the president is dead. Meanwhile, a couple of weeks later in Chicago, Carter G. Woodson and 6 guys said, look, we got to do something about this movie, about the racism of the era, and about the climate that Booker's philosophy supported. And so the association was the result of that kind of discussion. And the next year they started the Journal of Negro History. And Howard has a full set. And it started out in 1916 as a rather rigorously researched outlet for articles by folks who were qualified to do the articles. 2 or 3 reasons Woodson insisted on that. One was the truth is not always easy to get, especially when you've had hundreds of years of people covering it up. And secondly, the journal, he said, should be an advertisement of the mental capacity of persons of color. And had that then have that kind of quality in it, and it has continued to have that quality over the years. Skip down to the Civil Rights Movement. In the late 1960s, when the Civil Rights Movement had left the streets, and a quick thing here, it first started out the Civil Rights Movement in the courts in the 30s. NAACP, guided by lawyers who were trained in the basement of this building and over at the Carnegie Building. This is where Thurgood Marshall and Spotswood Robinson and Olive Scott and others were prepped by Charles H. Houston, their guide, to do the foundation for the legal part of the Civil Rights Movement. Under Martin Luther King, the movement hit the streets big time, as we all know. Then it went to campus. It went to business. It went to education generally. And when, after the assassination of King in April 1968, there was the beginning of on-campus black studies. All along, Woodson's group had been a community-based group. As a matter of fact, Woodson wanted, and he taught here for a while, but the vice president of Howard University said when Woodson talked about starting a course on black folks, we don't need that kind of stuff. All y'all black, you know that. We don't need this. And so Woodson, very angry, and said he'd never work at a college again in life. And with one exception, he kept his word. For a couple of years, he was dean of West Virginia State. But he started the association, lived off of grant money, off of some of the money for selling copies of the Journal of Negro History, and occasional books. He lived in that house on 1538 9th Street all of his life, and would only come over here for speeches. But he swore he had to be independent. And so he remained that way, and gave encouragement to other folks about independence. But when the white institution started admitting not just a Du Bois here, and Alexander Crummell there, and a Carter Woodson over there, and we call that the medicine drop thing of desegregation, a drop and attack. In 1969, hundreds of middle and lower income blacks were almost literally recruited into places like the University of Indiana, like the East Lansing, Michigan State. Columbia had its share, although that's another long story about having been introduced to older blacks. But when these new students to higher ed black, who did not come to Howard and who did not go to Morehouse or Spelman or Clark or Morris Brown, went to these places, they looked at the curriculum and were outraged, saying, you say you're objective, you say you're comprehensive, we don't see any blackness here. What we see is slavery. What we see is disorder in the cities among poor people who are black, but we don't see anything else. And it was almost an intellectual riot among these young folks in these different places to correct this kind of oversight that it was so thick that the folks who omitted including us were startled and asked what was the problem. And they were so sure they were right that to raise a contradiction to that was seen as we don't understand. I've been right so long, what you mean? I'm the real deal. There can't be any other, because I'm it. After all, the Son of God was white, and therefore his daddy must be white. That kind of arrogance. And the brother said, no, that ain't going to get it. That ain't going to get it. And so the movement then took a lot of energy and is exemplified most vividly by an old cover of Newsweek magazine at Cornell University. There's a brother standing in the basketball stadium, arena I guess you call it, in the bleachers, with a shotgun in his hand, bandolier of shells across his chest, saying, we're going to get some black studies in this white place. And they ended up doing it. That happened across the country. So much so that the Ford Foundation said, one of the ways we can further help the cause of you all are now Afro-Americans, one of the ways we can help you all is to set up some money to start some departments. And so in 1969, that process was launched. And our department upstairs was built with that Ford initial money. $145,000. I got the paperwork of the begging, of the application, that set up the department. But in that year, about 25 other institutions got money to set up Afro-American Studies departments. And many more got money to have institutes and programs. So that by 1974, there were about 60 places offering at least a BA in what we called in those days Afro-American, African-American studies. Now we call them Afro-American studies and black studies. We only picked up the Afro-American after that had become a nationally used term in terms of the general media. Then in 1991 or 2, Henry Louis Gates, and I'll be mentioning him in a second further, John Blassingame, the great historian of the black community during slavery, and about 18 other people were invited by the Ford Foundation to come to New York. They wanted to talk to us. I said, what the hell do you want to talk to me about? Can't you tell me before I get there? So I decide whether I stay home and do my ribs or come on up to New York. And so I go. And it was actually earlier than the time I mentioned. And one person said, I was one of the individuals who decided on what schools would be funded to have Afro-American studies programs back in the 1969-70 period. At that time, we were establishing programs. Now, this time, we want to support curriculum. This was an Irish lady, Mrs. Shannon, saying that we want to do curriculum for black folks. She just put that language, but the money and curriculum, sometimes there's no gap between the money and what you're going to do. If the money smells one way, the thing is supposed to smell somewhat like that. No bacon spitch. Y'all gonna be good? That kind of thing, right? So she indicated that the Ford Foundation has spent $5 million on the first round. And that is setting up departments, assisting. And the usual practice was they'd give you money to start if you pledged to continue. And that's what Howard did. They had another $10 million to continue on curriculum. And this is where a lot of places could get $300,000 at max to do Afro stuff. I see two kinds of white studies operations in the country. One is the establishment of centers for the study of topics about black folks. The most famous in some circles is the Gilda Lerman Center at Yale, called The Study of Slavery and Abolition, and then have a lot of subtitles. Gilda and Lerman, two different persons, put up a lot of money to set up this. And to show you the kind of money they have on hand, they give $25,000 first prizes for the best book of the year. They call it the Frederick Douglass Award. They have some very good people who are not Afro there. David Blight came down from Emeritus to the center. He's done some good work on slavery, Civil War, and remembrance, and so on. There are similar places. Chicago has a strange place, Center for the Study of Race. It has, and I said this carefully because that's I won't use the word alma mater, that's where I got my PhD. You can have only one mom, and that's Morehouse for me. They have a strange center where folks that I have never heard of are put in charge of it. That's an old game. Get someone who has no traction, and I could stand corrected, because if this goes out, I'll get letters. The current, put it this way, Dr. Johnson, the current head, is a solid scholar. Some of the others are new to us, even though they may have the same genetic history, and so on. I call those kinds of places slightly beige for what they are and what they're doing. The one at Yale has no problem in saying what it is. They call it Center for the Study of Slavery and Western Culture, and International Area Studies, and so on. So they're upfront about it. There are about 30 places that have programs for whiteness studies. And I passed out, with the conference I had, a handout about white studies. Here's what white studies, they claim, is. It is the field, an attempt to, and I think it's a worthy attempt, raise the question and examine the issue of what it really means to say one is white in America. What does it mean individually? What does it mean ethically? What does it mean politically? And some of these programs do a good job in tracing the construction of whiteness as a concept. Whites did not call themselves white until they saw us. It started with Columbus. They would call themselves by their political names. I'm a Hungarian. I'm an Italian. I'm from Florence. I'm a Tuscan. I'm German. I'm an Englishman. And then when they started moving into non-white spots of the world, the term white comes in. As a matter of fact, there's a book called White Over Black by Winthrop Jordan that traces the English version of this business pretty well. And he makes a point that the white studies movement is slowly getting to, that from Columbus down to 1687, folks refer to themselves as white and Christian, generally speaking, and by their country names. If they were over here, I'm Prussian, I'm Bavarian, I'm Sicilian. Not that Sicilians were here in great numbers in those days. And Africans, he's a Mandingo. He's a Senegalese. He's a Congoite. He's a Wolof. And then by the time the Constitution was written, they had condensed the things to sound this way. Wherever they were from, in terms of Europeans, they simply call themselves white. Wherever we were from, in terms of Africa, we were called black. And wherever the Choctaws and the Dakotas and the Manhatts and the Powhatans and Potomacs, they were red. So color then becomes the great identifier. And in other words, the construction of whiteness is as deliberate over the years, some people are in these white studies programs, as the construction of blackness as a you start out with using the term as an adjective, and then you try to make it a noun and make it a part of nature. An adjective is what you say in your head. It's red, it's green, it's whatever. And then when you push it to the level of being a noun, if you're not careful, just hit it a couple of times and it's a thing. It's a physical reality. And in the construction then of whiteness, some of these emerging scholars are saying America was a great place for that to happen. Because you have the red contrast and you have the black contrast. But you also have, for the first time, ordinary Caucasians being told by the upper classes, you and I are the same compared to. So you had a democratizing of color at that, in that fashion and at that level. For the first time, poor whites who couldn't make it in Europe could become ranchers over here by taking the land of other people. Become big shots over here because they were taking the country from other people. And they did. And in some of the whiteness studies, they created land ownership with being white. Native Americans were not expected to hang on to the land because they were going to have it taken from them. Blacks were not expected to gain the land because slaves can't possess land. So the very soil itself became a white defining element that gave property a kind of weight that you would not believe until you think about it. That property claims in this country are as intense as the claim to life itself, because they equated property ownership with life itself. And for the first time in human history, this kind of thing happened on this scale. and the construction of whiteness. Then some of the other programs look at the emergence of the industrial bureaucracies in this country. And folks who built these bureaucracies generally were Caucasians. And they were at the supervisory level, even though a lot of black folks worked at the bottom. So the argument goes in white studies that managerial life became an expected lifestyle for middle-class Caucasians. And in one study I looked at, watch this number, folks, 47% of all white males past 21 and employed have sit-down indoor jobs. The white race does not lift things anymore. Those who do stand, the other stats show, are the folks who supervise, watch this, construction. Folks who supervise the building of large structures. They are outside. But increasingly they're coming inside with computers. And when I worked on the Detroit Afro-American Studies, Afro-American Museum, I did not go to Detroit. I worked on the computer, looking at the thing. Although I'm black and inside, right? But here, we're talking about how whiteness is associated with privilege, with ownership, with supervision. And in terms of media transferring these ideas, the media being controlled by the same set of folks, and I'm thinking of newspapers, I'm thinking of print, and increasingly now I'm thinking of visual media, then unconsciously saw whiteness of government, whiteness of business, whiteness of military, basically, whiteness of agriculture at the serious level, meaning a guy got 2,000 acres, 3,000 acres. The king ranched 43,000 acres in Texas. All that is non-Afro and non-Native American. So the normality of whiteness, then, in these studies, is one that says that whiteness is an identification of not only purity, the old one out of literary history, but also of power, also of privilege, and also of personal satisfaction. As a matter of fact, and I'll stop in a second. So, there is a person at Amherst, Caucasian person, female, who had a list, which I couldn't find mine, of 47 reasons why whiteness pays. One example of why it pays is that, she says, if you're feeling low, you just think of an African and feel better. Thank God it ain't me. If you walk into a room and suddenly it gets a little quiet. If you go into a restaurant, you don't have to have a hassle because of what you look like when you walk in the door. Unless you're at the bum level. She ain't talking about the bum level. She's talking about the greens place, right? She goes through a whole list of automatic rewards that your category delivers in that kind of a sense. And then some places have done some studies, and there is no one place. There is a place called the Center for the Study of Whiteness. It's based in New Jersey, Burlington, New Jersey. And it's about 10 years old. They had their first national meeting back in '95. And came only 54 people showed up at that one. Now the one that's going to be done in Long Island in March, I'm tempted to go because it is not. This one is not anti. The better whiteness studies departments are critical of the whiteness business. This is why they're there. The conservatives are going crazy, saying that these are guilt-ridden, self-flagellating, marginal folks who are pushing white studies. And I disagree with that. When I first heard white studies, I was of the same sense of saying, oh wow, that's arrogant. But then as I started looking at some of their materials and so on, I said, oh, they are doing, in white studies, what we are trying to do in Afro studies, and that is to make folks aware of their context in life, their political context, their cultural context. In our case, to survive. In their case, hopefully to do better in terms of their personal lives. Now, a lot of opponents of white studies will say further, they want whites to give up power. Well, the Southerners said that in the civil rights movement, that if we desegregate, we lose power. Now, what happened in a quick fashion is that there was a desegregation of manners, but not of the money. Are you following me here? They will say Dr. Adams and Mrs. Adams and so on, but they still run the bank. I'm sure you can have a cup of coffee. You won't agree with that? Flash with that and so on. So the basic stuff has not changed. The white studies movement is still at the stage then of courses around the country, basically. Princeton has courses, Yale has courses, University of Wisconsin, especially Bagan and Gay, has very good set of courses on whiteness studies. UCLA has some courses on whiteness studies. And what they are trying to do in all of these courses is to say that there is no monolithic thing connected with folks of Caucasian descent. And that the structural connections of whiteness with the economics and the politics has to be examined from that angle that black studies has been examining the entire country. So in my notes here I said there is a rough parallelism between some of the concerns of black studies and the concerns of whiteness studies. Where you do need to tell the emperor that you not only have bad clothes, but you got bad breath, especially at the moral level. I passed out, I may have some left, and if not, you can get them later, some handouts, a couple of three of them, that listed some of the better books that one could go into detail about the whiteness studies. Now, one of the best ones, I have the dust cover for it. It's by, if you want to write it down, some of you who don't have the handout, David Roediger, R-O-E-D-I-G-E-R. It's called Colored White. Color, that's a verb. Colored White. Subtitle, Transcending the Racial Past. It's one of the more interesting collections of very good essays, mostly by him, that deal with the whiteness issue. And then I have, by Carl Swain, who's down at Vanderbilt, The New White Nationalism in America, Its Challenge to Integration. In other words, this particular book deals with the problem as a political social phenomenon. This particular book deals with the problem as an academic thing to understand in order to have the larger community of whiteness understand that it is not immune to analysis. It is not the norm. It is not built in nature. It's built in political construction, just as these other categories of ethnicity have been built. Let me sort of summarize then by saying that American intellectual life is a work in progress and process, within the race and outside the race. The Black Studies movement, like the Civil Rights movement, has spawned the White Studies movement, the Feminist Studies movement, and the Native American Studies movement. And in some rough kind of way, that's appropriate. Because I agree with those who argue that the cause and the case of African-descended folks represents the most vivid of the problems and the most critical of the problems of self-definition and self-transcendence. I'm done. Take questions. Couple.
Yes, I can appreciate your analysis about whiteness and white studies, but do you see in the contemporary sense the policies that are being advocated by our administration?
Which administration? On campus, off campus?
Off campus, the big one.
The national administration, the Bush administration.
Absolutely.
Let's just call it. Okay, go ahead.
Do you see their advocacy for concepts like democratizing of the Middle East and other areas, an expansion of whiteness?
Without a doubt. A quick reaction, without a doubt. The idea of gunpoint democracy, that's like a contradiction in terms. Gunpoint democracy would simply mean that you would have divisions that you can control much easier than a unified operation. You deal with the 3 or 4 guys that you know who are dealing with oil. Don't deal with the government. In other words, you've softened up the place. And some places, like the black struggle, if prematurely softened, evaporates. The energy that comes from unity disappears. And I think that whether they have thought of it that way or not, I think that the gambling that you not only make political authority a private matter, which democracy has a part of that, but also the economics being private, then you can continue to, because you started first in terms of the American economic and oil producing system, you have the upper hand. They have started democracy ABC. This country has been at it, and perfectly, since the Constitution. So that this would be another way of continuing, I like the word hegemony, more than just whiteness, even though the undercoating is as you described, and that is it would be a continuation of business by other means.
But that also then, as a follow-up, assumes that the indigenous population agrees.
That's why you should turn gunpoint democracy, meaning it did not agree, else it could have been persuaded without the violence. In other words, if democracy is such an attractive element in and of itself, you don't need to go to war with a place to introduce it, because what you do is introduce a counter dictatorship where folks unify to push you out. So I don't see democracy going in that fashion to these places. They will be put another way, electronics have collapsed physical time, but not historical time. Meaning by that, in a flash you can be someplace electronically. But that place may be 1850, 1875, 1700. When we were in South Africa back in 95, my wife and I, she was appalled, I was too, by how some of the gender relations were manifested. The women having huge burdens in the countryside, and the fellow with a long pipe, slowly. And these ladies are almost to fall, and the guy is strolling. You can get there like that, but then you see something that ended for us in the 40s. And overall, I mean, we still have what we call Mother's Day for welfare, where the guys ain't working at all. And so on. But those are my answers to you. That democracy cannot be imposed undemocratically. It has to evolve from within the system.
Which then means that the policy is going to fail.
Yes. But let me say this, and then I think another question, other possibilities here. It's a sign of the arrogance of whiteness to assume that the policy is okay, because they enunciated it. And that is the kind of pride that goes before a fall, to use that expression. And one of the whiteness studies thing I see evolving is to say to these fellas, don't let your own fantasies about being superhuman lead you to subhuman disaster. And this is called overreaching. There's a very fine book by Paul Johnson called The Rise and Decline of Great Nations. And he says that there's an arrogance period when they're at their heights. And they grab too much beyond their borders and can't digest. And even from Alexander the Great down to Second World War. This happens when the whiteness business, that somehow I convince myself that I'm infallible, that what I do is the only way to do it, that when you say flesh color advantages, you're only talking about me. When you talk about the best system of governance in the world is what I do. And that kind of pride then can blind one to the rest of humanity. And ironically, the rest of humanity will have its revenge. Are there other? Dr. Hart.
I think that Adams and taking notes. As you went from black studies to white studies, I guess my question might be, how might whiteness studies look as a part of black studies? Could white studies be done in
it has to operate, one writer has stated it this way, and I think I concur, complementary, roughly parallel, but not the same thing. And I said this with some care. One of the problems of having an African Studies department and an Afro-American Studies department in the same administrative unit has to do with the target audiences. I've served as an outside reviewer of a number of programs around the country. And one I looked at as a member of a team had that kind of arrangement. 2/3 of the budget went to the African Studies part, because the folks in that part of the department had to get to Africa sooner or later, back and forth. And one guy says, what's the big deal? You can study poor black folks by taking the bus down the streets. Crudely put, but not inaccurate. The other is that African studies tends to study the elites in these countries. They're now beginning to do parliament studies. But I've had people from Howard saying, I want to go and talk to the head of the such and such. Take it to your leader kind of research. And Afro-American studies have focused on the bottom of this stratification pyramid. That's where we started out, looking at those who needed us most, not those who needed us least. This is why the talented test thing never became a big subject, except for argument. Yes, and where we start where the need and the blood was the thickest. And so white studies can have us all look more critically at the white phenomenon and not have an expression like the one that I grew up hearing when you said to somebody, that's the truth, but swear for God and 6 white folks. I mean, this is equating these people with God. And we have another that problem now. In today's post, it's a thing about somebody like a county family, where the young men don't want to be seen as white boys in the classroom. Don't want to be seen as nerds. So there is a role for looking at, in a comparative sense, the two phenomena, and that is what happens in the white classroom, what happens in the black classroom, and what happens between the rooms, and so on. So those are my thoughts, that they can be complementary, because both are race critical, in that they ask you to think and not to receive as though the 10 Commandments, because some white guys say, here it is. Well, thank you very much for your attention and your time.
Here's a question.
Oh, there's a question?